Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES horizon and watched the stars through the wide windows. The deep black space filled with tiny lights that had guided humans for thousands of years. But now something was very wrong, and he could feel it in his bones, the way his grandfather used to say he could feel storms coming across the plains of Kansas before the weather satellites ever showed a cloud. Lisa Taylor sat at her communications station with her fingers dancing across the control panel as she monitored the usual chatter from the outer colonies and mining stations that dotted this part of space. Like scattered coins on a dark table, her blonde hair tied back in the regulation style, but a few strands had escaped a frame. Her face as she concentrated on the incoming signals that seemed normal enough, until they were not normal. Albin Parker checked his tactical displays for the third time in 10 minutes because something felt off about the readings they were getting from the long-range sensors. The kind of feeling that made veteran space officers wake up in cold sweats, remembering battles they had survived by trusting their instincts more than their instruments. The UES Horizon was humanity's newest deep space exploration vessel and carried 200 souls, including scientists and engineers and communications specialists and tactical officers who had signed up to map new star systems and catalog alien life forms and maybe find new worlds for humans to call home. Not to face the kind of threat that was now showing up on their screens like a growing storm cloud made of metal and death and alien hatred. The ship had been on routine patrol in the Outer Rim territories for 6 months now, and the crew had settled into the comfortable rhythm of deep space exploration, cataloging stellar phenomena and investigating promising worlds and sending regular reports back to Earth Command through the quantum communication relays that kept humanity connected across the vast distances between stars. But routine had just died a sudden and violent death when the sensors began picking up something that should not exist and could not be real, except that it was very real indeed, and moving toward human space with the inexorable certainty of a hurricane bearing down on a coastal town. Lisa looked up from her station with confusion written across her features like words on a page that no one wanted to read. Her voice cutting through the quiet hum of the bridge as she reported what her instruments were telling her, even though she clearly did not want to believe it herself. The sensors were detecting a massive fleet of unknown vessels approaching from the direction of the galactic core where no human ship had ever traveled and no friendly species was known to exist. The computer estimated over 500 individual ships of varying sizes, but all of them larger than anything in the human fleet and moving in perfect formation, like a school of predatory fish swimming through the dark ocean of space. Jake felt his stomach drop as he processed the information because 500 alien ships could only mean one thing, and that thing was conquest or destruction or both. Humanity had been exploring space for only 50 years and had encountered a few alien species during that time, but none of them had been hostile and certainly none of them had possessed fleets of this size or apparent technological sophistication. The largest human fleet ever assembled had numbered barely 40 ships during the Mars Independence War, and that had been considered a massive armada by the standards of the time. Ben ran the tactical analysis 3 times before he was willing to report the results because the numbers were so bad that he hoped his computers were malfunctioning, but they were not malfunctioning and the results were exactly as terrible as they appeared to be. Each alien vessel was at least twice the size of the largest human dreadnought, and their energy signatures suggested weapons and defensive systems that were decades or maybe centuries ahead of human technology. If these ships were hostile, then humanity was facing a threat that could destroy every human world and colony and space station without breaking stride. The communications panel came alive with urgent messages from Earth Command as other ships and stations began detecting the approaching fleet. Admiral Kate Sullivan's voice crackled through the quantum link with barely controlled tension as she demanded updated sensor readings and tactical assessments and contingency plans that everyone knew did not exist because no one had ever planned for a threat of this magnitude. The outer colonies were already beginning to panic as the news spread through civilian channels faster than official military communications could travel. Lisa monitored the alien transmissions and tried to make sense of the strange electromagnetic patterns that seemed to follow no recognizable communication protocol. The signals were complex and layered with harmonic frequencies that hurt her ears when she tried to isolate them through her headphones. But there was something almost musical about the transmissions that reminded her of whale songs or the way wind sounded when it blew through the metal framework of the space stations where she had grown up. Jake ordered the ship to general quarters as the crew prepared for whatever was coming, even though they all knew that preparation was largely meaningless against such overwhelming odds. The Horizon was an exploration vessel, not a warship, and carried only basic defensive weapons that might as well have been slingshots against the technological superiority of the approaching fleet. But humans had never been good at surrendering without a fight, and that stubborn streak had carried them from caves to the stars, despite every logical reason why they should have given up along the way. The alien fleet continued its approach with the mechanical precision of a doomsday clock counting down to midnight, and Jake Morrison stood on his bridge watching death approach his species while wondering if anyone would remember that humans had at least tried to stand against the darkness. Dr. Amy Rodriguez bent over her workstation in the science lab of the USS Horizon and studied the alien transmission patterns with the focused intensity of a scholar trying to decode an ancient language that might hold the key to saving civilization. The electromagnetic signatures were unlike anything in the human database of known species and seemed to follow mathematical principles that suggested a highly advanced understanding of quantum mechanics and harmonic resonance theory. But there was something else buried in the data that made her pulse quicken with the excitement of discovery, even as her mind recoiled from the implications of what she was seeing. The Zephyrian Empire had conquered dozens of worlds across the galaxy, according to the fragmentary intelligence reports that were trickling in from human deep space monitoring stations. Their technology was so advanced that they could glass an entire planet in a matter of hours, and their military doctrine seemed to focus on complete subjugation or total annihilation of any species that refused to submit to their rule. But Amy was not thinking about military doctrine as she analyzed their communication protocols, because she had stumbled onto something that made her hands shake as she reached for the intercom. Button Tony Blake was 3 decks down in the engineering section when the call came through from the science lab, his hands covered with the synthetic lubricant that kept the quantum communication array functioning at peak efficiency while he worked to boost the signal strength so that the Horizon could maintain contact with Earth Command, despite the electromagnetic interference that the alien fleet was generating simply by existing in normal space. The modifications he was making were experimental and potentially dangerous, but the situation called for risks that would normally be unthinkable. Amy's voice crackled through the comm system with barely contained excitement as she explained what she had discovered about the alien neural architecture and communication systems. The Zephyrians seemed to operate on a collective consciousness model where individual minds were linked through crystalline resonance patterns that operated in the same frequency ranges as human vocal cords, which meant that theoretically human speech might be able to interfere with their thought processes in ways that could be weaponized. If someone could figure out how to amplify and focus the effect. Tony listened to the explanation while his hands continued their work on the communication array, because engineers learned early in their careers to multitask or die when ship systems failed in the middle of crisis situations. But what Amy was describing sounded like science fiction rather than science fact, until he realized that the modifications he was making to boost communication range might also amplify other types of signals, including human voices. If someone was crazy enough to try it. Lisa Taylor was on the bridge monitoring the approaching alien fleet when the first test began in the engineering section. Tony had created a feedback loop in the communication system that was designed to amplify electromagnetic signals across multiple frequency bands, and Amy had convinced Jake to let her try speaking into the modified array to see if human vocal patterns could affect the alien scout ships that were probing ahead of the main fleet like the advance guard of an approaching army. The effect was immediate and startling as Lisa watched 3 Zephyrian scout vessels suddenly veer away from their assigned patrol routes and begin flying in erratic patterns that suggested their navigation systems were malfunctioning or their pilot were experiencing some kind of neurological interference. The ships wobbled through space like drunken birds, before finally retreating toward the main fleet at maximum speed while broadcasting what sounded like distress signals in their strange harmonic language. Jake Morrison felt his heart skip a beat as he realized what had just happened, because the implications were staggering. Humanity had just discovered that their voices could be used as weapons against an alien species that possessed technology centuries ahead of human development, but the range was limited and the effects seemed temporary, and they still faced a fleet of 500 warships that could destroy human civilization without breaking stride, unless someone could figure out how to turn this discovery into something more than a laboratory. Curiosity Emmy ran more tests with different crew members, speaking into the modified communication system while Tony worked to understand the technical principles behind what was happening. The human voice produced complex harmonic patterns that included emotional resonance and tonal variations that seemed to create interference with the crystalline matrices that the Zephyrians used for neural networking. But the effect was stronger when the speaker was experiencing intense emotions like anger or fear or determination. Ben Parker coordinated with the other human ships in the area to share the discovery and begin preliminary testing of the vocal weapon effect. But the results were inconsistent because not every ship had the technical modifications necessary to amplify human voices across the right frequency ranges, and not every crew member could produce the vocal patterns that seemed to be most effective. Against alien neural systems, the Zephyrian fleet continued its advance toward human space while the desperate experiments continued aboard the scattered human vessels. Admiral Kate Sullivan ordered every available ship to begin working on modifications to their communication systems based on Tony Blake's specifications. But time was running short, and the alien armada was moving faster than human engineers could adapt their technology to this new form of warfare. Rodriguez made another breakthrough when she realized that the emotional content of human speech was just as important as the technical frequency patterns. Fear and anger and defiance seemed to create stronger interference effects than calm, rational speech, which suggested that the aliens had evolved past the kind of emotional responses that still drove human behavior and made them vulnerable to the psychological impact of human vocal expression. Lisa practiced different vocal techniques while monitoring the alien fleet's communications, trying to find the right combination of tone and emotion and frequency that would maximize the disruptive effect on Zephyrian neural networks. Her voice became hoarse from the repeated experiments, but she could see the results on her tactical display. As enemy scout ships continued to malfunction whenever she spoke into the modified array with sufficient emotional intensity, the discovery spread through the human fleet like wildfire as word of the vocal weapon reached every ship and station and colony in the Outer Rim. But the Zephyrian armada was still approaching, and 500 alien warships represented overwhelming force even if humans could disrupt a few scout vessels with their voices. The war was just beginning, and humanity would need to find ways to amplify and focus their new weapon if they hoped to survive the coming storm. Captain Ryan Davis led his small strike force of 12 human vessels toward the edge of Zephyrian space where the alien scouts were conducting reconnaissance missions against the outer mining colonies. His flagship U.S. Defiance carried some of the best communications equipment in the human fleet, along with volunteers who had proven most effective at generating the vocal patterns that could disrupt alien neural networks. But even with these advantages, he knew they were flying into a situation where the odds of survival were measured in single-digit percentages at best. Wright sat at the communications station aboard the Defiance and practiced the vocal techniques that Dr. Rodriguez had developed through her experiments on the horizon. The key seemed to be combining specific emotional states with harmonic frequencies that matched the resonance patterns of Zephyrian crystalline neural matrices. But it was exhausting work that left her throat raw and her nerves frayed because speaking with sufficient anger and defiance to affect alien minds meant channeling emotions that were difficult to sustain for extended periods. Sam Mitchell worked alongside Emma at the secondary communications station and had discovered that his deeper voice could penetrate Zephyrian shields more effectively than higher-pitched vocals. But the range was still limited to a few thousand kilometers, which meant the human ships would have to get dangerously close to alien vessels before the vocal weapons could be effective. Close enough that conventional alien weapons could destroy human ships before the voices could disable alien crews. The first real test came when Ryan's strike force encountered a Zephyrian patrol, consisting of 6 medium-sized warships that were mapping the asteroid belt where human mining operations extracted the rare metals needed for quantum drive construction. The alien vessels were sleek and deadly-looking, with crystalline growths along their hulls that seemed to pulse with internal light as they moved through space with the fluid grace of predators hunting in their natural environment. Emma spoke into the modified communication array with all the anger and defiance she could summon while thinking about the human colonies that would be destroyed if the Zephyrian fleet reached inhabited space. Her voice carried across the void on frequencies that human scientists were only beginning to understand, but the alien patrol was immediate and dramatic as their formation began to break apart and individual ships started flying in erratic patterns. 2 of the Zephyrian vessels collided with each other when their navigation systems failed under the assault of human vocal patterns, their crystalline hulls cracking like broken glass as the ships tumbled through space, broadcasting distress signals that sounded like electronic screams. But the other 4 ships adapted quickly and began implementing countermeasures that filtered out the frequencies that human voices used to disrupt their neural networks. Sam joined his voice to Emma's as they tried different combinations of tone and emotion and harmonic resonance, their words becoming weapons that could reach across space to touch alien minds with concepts that the Zephyrians had apparently abandoned centuries ago when they chose technological perfection over emotional expression. But the adapted alien ships were learning to resist the vocal attacks and returning fire with energy weapons that lit up space with deadly rainbow colors. Di Rodriguez had transmitted new research data to the strike force before they left human space, and Amy's discoveries suggested that certain emotional combinations were more effective than others against Zephyrian neural architecture. Laughter seemed to create unpredictable interference patterns that were difficult for alien computers to filter, while songs and rhythmic chanting could maintain sustained effects over longer periods than simple speech. The strike force scattered as Zephyrian reinforcements arrived to investigate the disturbance. Ryan ordered his ships to retreat while continuing to broadcast vocal attacks against the pursuing alien vessels, but it was becoming clear that the Zephyrians were adapting faster than humans could develop new techniques, and the window of opportunity for this type of warfare might be closing before humanity could fully exploit their discovery. Emma experimented with singing old Earth folk songs while Sam tried reading poetry with dramatic emphasis, their voices becoming increasingly hoarse as they pushed their vocal cords beyond normal limits in the desperate attempt to find new ways to penetrate alien defenses. The crew of the Defiance listened to their own voices being used as weapons of war and wondered if this was how humanity would be remembered by the galaxy. Back in human space, the outer colonies were beginning their evacuation as massive transport ships loaded with desperate families fled toward the inner systems where they hoped the combined human fleet might be able to make a stand. Children cried as they were separated from their homes, and elderly colonists wept for the worlds they had spent their lives building only to see them abandoned in the face of an alien invasion that seemed unstoppable. The Henderson family managed to escape from the mining station on Europa just hours before Zephyrian scout ships arrived to begin their systematic destruction of human infrastructure, while the Gomez clan fled from their agricultural colony on Titan with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the fading hope that somewhere in the solar system there would be safe haven from the approaching storm. Ryan's strike force limped back toward friendly space with battle damage and depleted crews who had pushed themselves to the breaking point trying to weaponize human emotion against alien logic. They had proven that vocal warfare could work under the right circumstances, but they had also learned that the Zephyrians could adapt their defenses faster than humans could develop new attack methods. The alien fleet continued its inexorable advance toward the heart of human space, while scientists and engineers worked frantically to develop ways to amplify human voices across the vast distances that separated the scattered human colonies. The quantum communication network that had once carried messages of exploration and discovery now hummed with desperate plans for turning every human voice into a weapon that might somehow save their species from extinction. Admiral Kate Sullivan reviewed the tactical reports from Ryan's mission and realized that humanity's new weapon was powerful but limited. They needed to find ways to coordinate millions of human voices across multiple star systems if they hoped to generate effects strong enough to stop a fleet of 500 alien warships. But time was running out, and the Zephyrians were moving faster than human technology could adapt to meet this unprecedented threat to human survival. Admiral Kate Sullivan stood in the command center of Lunar Base and stared at the holographic display that showed the Zephyrian fleet approaching the outer edge of the solar system like a swarm of mechanical locusts intent on devouring everything humans had built among the stars. She had 43 ships under her command against 500 alien vessels, but the reports from Ryan Davis and his strike force had given her an idea that was either brilliant or completely insane, depending on how successfully human engineers could modify the quantum communication network in the next 18 hours. Lieutenant Commander Peter Yun coordinated the massive technical effort from his position aboard the Lunar Defense Station, where teams of engineers and technicians worked around the clock to reconfigure every communication, relay, and broadcast station in human space. The plan required linking every human voice into a single coordinated transmission that could reach across the solar system with enough power to overwhelm Zephyrian neural defenses before they could adapt their filtering systems. Nancy Kim monitored the incoming reports from colonies and stations throughout human space as millions of people prepared to lend their voices to Operation Voice Storm. Children practiced speaking with their parents, while elderly colonists, who had lived through the early days of space exploration, added their weathered voices to the growing chorus that would either save humanity or mark their final defiant gesture. Before extinction, Frank Lopez managed the technical coordination between different types of communication equipment as human engineers struggled to create a unified network from systems that had never been designed to work together. Military communication arrays had to interface with civilian broadcast stations, while mining operation transmitters were linked to deep space exploration vessels in a desperate attempt to create a single voice from millions of individual human speakers. The Zephyrian fleet entered the outer solar system and began its systematic destruction of human infrastructure with the methodical efficiency of a machine designed for conquest. Titan Base disappeared in a flash of superheated plasma while Europa Station broadcast its final transmission, before alien weapons turned the ice moon's surface into a field of molten slag that glowed like a dying star against the black of space. Peter Young felt sweat running down his face as he coordinated the final preparations for humanity's desperate gambit. Every human being capable of speech had been linked into the communication network through whatever devices they could find, including personal communicators and emergency broadcast systems, and even children's toys that contained voice transmission capabilities. The combined voices of 7 billion human beings were about to be focused into a single transmission that would either cripple the alien fleet or accomplish nothing at all. The countdown reached 0 and humanity spoke as one voice. Across the vast emptiness of space, millions of individual humans sang the same words at the same moment, while their combined vocal patterns were amplified and focused through the modified quantum communication network. The transmission reached the Zephyrian fleet at the speed of light, carrying with it all the anger and defiance and desperate hope that had driven humans from their home planet to the stars. The effect on the alien armada was immediate and devastating as hundreds of Zephyrian ships suddenly lost formation and began flying in chaotic patterns that suggested their crews were experiencing massive neural disruption. Several of their massive dreadnoughts collided with each other, while smaller vessels spun out of control like leaves, caught in a hurricane of electromagnetic interference that their technology could not filter or block. Nancy watched the tactical displays with growing excitement as alien ships throughout the fleet began experiencing system failures and communication breakdowns. The perfectly coordinated armada was dissolving into chaos as Zephyrian neural networks overloaded under the assault of 7 billion human voices speaking in unison. But even as she celebrated the initial success, she could see that some of the alien vessels were beginning to adapt. Their defenses. Admiral Cathus commanded the Zephyrian fleet from his flagship, deep within the protective formation of the armada, and he was old enough to remember the conquest of dozens of worlds, where inferior species had tried to resist the inevitable expansion of Zephyrian civilization, but nothing in his centuries of military experience had prepared him for the type of warfare that these humans were using against his forces. The alien commander ordered his fleet to switch to backup communication systems and maintain radio silence, while their technology specialists worked to develop filters that could block the human vocal transmissions. Zephyrian ships began implementing new defensive protocols that isolated their neural networks from external electromagnetic interference. But the damage had already been done, as nearly a third of the fleet was temporarily disabled by the coordinated human assault. Frank Lopez monitored the alien response and realized that the Zephyrians were adapting faster than humans had hoped they would. The vocal weapon was powerful, but it required constant innovation to stay ahead of alien countermeasures. He began coordinating with communication specialists throughout human space to develop new transmission patterns and frequency combinations that might penetrate the evolving Zephyrian defenses. Peter Young watched the tactical situation develop and felt a mixture of triumph and dread as he realized that humanity had won the first battle, but the war was far from over. The alien fleet was wounded but not defeated, and their technological superiority meant they would eventually develop defenses that could neutralize the human vocal weapon unless something more could be done to exploit this temporary advantage. Zephyrian ships that were still functional began regrouping around their flagship while their damaged vessels limped toward the outer system for repairs. But Admiral Cathus was already planning his response to this unexpected form of warfare, and the humans, who had dared to resist his armada with nothing more than their voices, would soon learn that the Zephyrian Empire had conquered the galaxy through adaptability as much as superior technology. Nancy Kim coordinated with colonies throughout human space as they prepared for the next phase of the battle, knowing that the vocal weapon had bought them time but not victory. The Zephyrian fleet was still capable of destroying human civilization, and their commander was clearly intelligent enough to learn from his initial defeat and develop new strategies for dealing with humanity's unique form of warfare. The alien armada continued its advance toward Earth while human voices continued to broadcast across space, carrying words of defiance and hope and determination that reached alien minds with messages their species had forgotten centuries ago when they chose conquest over cooperation. The window of opportunity was closing as Zephyrian technology adapted to counter the effects of human vocal warfare. Colonel Mary Johnson coordinated the development of new vocal warfare techniques from her command post on Mars, where human military specialists worked with linguists and communications experts to stay ahead of the rapidly adapting Zephyrian defenses. The aliens had learned to filter most human speech patterns, but Mary's team had discovered that certain types of vocal expression were much harder to block than simple conversation or even coordinated shouting. Children from Earth's schools became unlikely weapons in humanity's desperate fight for survival. When 10-year-old Kevin Walsh and his classmates discovered that their higher-pitched voices created unique interference patterns that penetrated Zephyrian filters more effectively than adult speech, the sound of children laughing and playing and singing nursery rhymes became a new form of acoustic warfare that left alien crews struggling with neural disruption they could not understand or counter. Amy Rodriguez made another breakthrough when she realized that human laughter produced complex and unpredictable acoustic patterns that Zephyrian technology could not anticipate or filter effectively. The spontaneous nature of genuine humor created electromagnetic signatures that were impossible to block because they changed constantly and followed no mathematical model that alien computers could analyze and neutralize. Comedy shows and stand-up routines became weapons of war as human broadcasters transmitted recordings of the greatest comedians in human history alongside live performances by anyone who could make people laugh. The sound of millions of humans laughing simultaneously created waves of acoustic interference that crippled entire sections of the Zephyrian fleet and left their crews experiencing something their warrior culture had abandoned long ago. Mary Johnson organized singing competitions among the human colonies where different groups tried to find musical combinations that would penetrate alien defenses. Gospel choirs from the southern colonies competed with opera singers from the European settlements, while rock bands and folk musicians and even electronic music artists contributed their voices to the growing arsenal of human acoustic weapons. The Zephyrian fleet adapted again by implementing more sophisticated filtering systems that could block most forms of human vocal expression, but the constant modifications to their defensive networks were beginning to strain their technology and reduce the overall efficiency of their fleet operations as more and more computing power was devoted to countering human voices instead of maintaining optimal combat readiness. Kevin Walsh and his elementary school classmates became heroes throughout human space when their spontaneous rendering of a silly playground song disabled 3 Zephyrian cruisers that had been advancing on the Mars orbital platforms. The children had no idea they were participating in warfare as they sang and laughed and played games that happened to produce acoustic patterns that alien neural networks could not process without shutting down. Amy Rodriguez worked with teams of scientists throughout the solar system to catalog the effects of different types of human vocal expression on Zephyrian technology. They discovered that emotional authenticity was crucial because synthetic or artificial vocal patterns had minimal impact while genuine human emotion could penetrate even the most sophisticated alien defenses. The Zephyrian forces regrouped around their massive flagship called the Void Piercer, a world-killer vessel that dwarfed even the largest human space stations and carried enough firepower to reduce planets to radioactive debris. Admiral Cathis had decided that the source of human resistance had to be eliminated permanently, and he began planning a direct assault on Earth itself. Murray coordinated with resistance cells on the occupied outer colonies, where humans who had been unable to evacuate continued to broadcast vocal attacks against Zephyrian occupation forces. Their voices carried messages of defiance and hope across space, while alien troops struggled to maintain control over populations that could turn any conversation into a weapon against their neural networks. The Void Piercer began its approach to Earth while smaller Zephyrian vessels formed a protective escort around the massive flagship. The alien command ship was protected by advanced shielding that seemed immune to human vocal attacks, and its weapons systems were capable of sterilizing Earth's surface in a matter of hours if Admiral Cathis decided that humanity could not be conquered and must therefore be destroyed. Children throughout the solar system continued their inadvertent contribution to the war effort as teachers and parents, organized games and activities that happened to produce the acoustic patterns most effective against alien technology. Playgrounds and schools became strategic assets in humanity's fight for survival, while the children themselves remained blissfully unaware of their importance to the species. War had become a battle of innovation and adaptation as humans struggled to find new ways to weaponize their voices, while Zephyrians developed increasingly sophisticated defenses against acoustic interference. But the constant modifications were taking their toll on alien fleet efficiency, and some of their ships were beginning to show signs of system strain from the continuous defensive adaptations. Made one final discovery that would change everything, when she realized that the emotional content of human vocal expression was more important than the technical frequency patterns. The feelings and thoughts and hopes and fears that humans conveyed through their voices carried information that Zephyrian technology could detect but could not understand or replicate or defend against effectively. The Void Piercer approached Earth's orbital defense network while human voices continued to broadcast across space, carrying with them the accumulated emotional experience of a species that had climbed from caves to stars. Through determination and cooperation and the stubborn refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds, Kevin Walsh practiced his multiplication tables with his classmates while their voices unknowingly created interference patterns that disrupted Zephyrian navigation systems light years away. The innocence and wonder and simple joy of human children becoming weapons in a war they did not understand against an enemy they had never seen. The final battle was approaching as the Void Piercer closed on humanity's homeworld, while every human voice in the solar system prepared for one last desperate transmission that would either save their species or mark their final defiant gesture before the silence of extinction. The Void Piercer approached Earth like a mechanical mountain moving through space with the inexorable certainty of death itself. Admiral Cathus stood on the command deck of his flagship and watched the small blue world that had spawned the strange species that dared to fight his fleet with nothing more than their voices. The massive world-killer ship was protected by shields that had repelled the weapons of a dozen conquered civilizations, and its hull bristled with enough firepower to crack continents and boil oceans. Jake Morrison coordinated the final desperate gambit from the bridge of the UES horizon, while every human being on Earth and throughout the colonies prepared to lend their voice to one last transmission. 7 billion people linked through the quantum communication network that Tony Blake and his engineering teams had modified beyond all safety parameters in the desperate hope that raw vocal power could accomplish what conventional weapons could. Not Lisa Taylor stood at her communications station and felt the weight of humanity's future pressing down on her shoulders as she prepared to coordinate the most important broadcast in human history. Every man, woman, and child who could speak was ready to participate in something that had never been attempted before. The simultaneous vocalization of an entire species focused into a single transmission that would either save their world or mark their final defiant gesture. The song they had chosen was Amazing Grace, selected not for its religious significance, but for its emotional resonance and historical importance to human culture. The simple melody had been sung by slaves and soldiers and sailors and pioneers throughout human history, and it carried within its notes the accumulated hope and suffering and triumph of generations who had faced impossible odds and somehow found the strength to continue. Admiral Cathus watched his tactical displays as the human homeworld prepared for what appeared to be another coordinated vocal attack. His ships had adapted their defenses to counter most forms of human acoustic warfare, and the Void Piercer itself was completely immune to the vocal transmissions that had disrupted lesser vessels. The World Killer ship continued its approach while smaller escort vessels formed a protective formation around their flagship. 7 billion human voices began to sing in unison across the vast emptiness of space. The words of Amazing Grace carried on quantum frequencies that had been modified to amplify not just sound but the emotional content and historical significance that gave meaning to human vocal expression. The song reached across the light between worlds, carrying with it the hopes and dreams and desperate determination of an entire species. The harmonics of 7 billion voices singing together created something that transcended normal acoustic phenomena and approached the realm of pure emotion made manifest in sound waves that carried the collective soul of humanity through space. The quantum communication network strained under the load as it transmitted not just audio, but the accumulated emotional experience of a species that had learned to find beauty in darkness and hope in despair. Void Piercer's shields flickered, and failed as the transmission reached the massive alien vessel. Admiral Cathus felt something he had not experienced in centuries. As the human song penetrated his ship's defenses and touched his mind with concepts that Zephyrian civilization had abandoned long ago, the sound carried memories of cooperation and sacrifice and love that his warrior species had discarded in their pursuit of galactic domination. The alien commander staggered as the full emotional weight of 7 billion human voices singing Amazing Grace overwhelmed his neural implants and connected him to feelings he had thought were weakness. The song spoke of redemption and grace and the possibility that even the lost could find their way home. Concepts that had no meaning in Zephyrian military doctrine but somehow resonated with something deep in his genetic memory. Lisa Taylor watched her instruments as the alien fleet began to respond to humanity's song in ways that no one had predicted. Zephyrian ships throughout the Armada were broadcasting what appeared to be surrender signals, while their crews struggled to process emotions they had not felt for generations. The mechanical precision of their formation dissolved as individual ships began moving in patterns that suggested confusion rather than regression. Admiral Cathus experienced something that Zephyrian science claimed was impossible as the human song triggered memories of his species' ancient past when they had been explorers and philosophers rather than conquerors. The emotional content of Amazing Grace bypassed his technological defenses and spoke directly to neural pathways that had been dormant for centuries. 7 billion voices continued their song while the quantum communication network carried not just sound but the essence of human emotional expression across space. The transmission contained the accumulated wisdom and pain and joy of a species that had learned to find meaning in suffering and beauty in sacrifice. Concepts that were alien to Zephyrian military culture but somehow familiar to their suppressed emotional heritage. Jake Morrison watched the tactical displays with growing amazement as the entire Zephyrian fleet began to withdraw from Earth's orbital space. The alien ships were not retreating in defeat but moving with the slow, deliberate motion of beings who were experiencing a fundamental change in their understanding of the universe and their place within it. The Void Piercer broadcast a message in clear human language as Admiral Cathus spoke for the first time without the mechanical translation systems that had filtered emotion from Zephyrian communications. His words carried wonder and confusion and something that might have been the beginning of regret as he tried to understand what the human song had awakened in his ancient mind. The alien fleet withdrew to the edge of the solar system while Zephyrian crews struggled to process emotions they had thought were primitive weaknesses. The song of 7 billion human voices had accomplished what no weapon could achieve by reminding a warrior species of what they had lost when they chose conquest over cooperation and domination over understanding. Lisa coordinated the establishment of communication protocols between human and Zephyrian representatives as both species began the complex process of learning to speak to each other without weapons or threats. The human voice that had stopped a war fleet became the foundation for the first peaceful contact between humanity and an alien civilization. Jake Morrison found himself promoted to admiral as humanity established the Vocal Diplomacy Corps with Lisa Taylor as its first director. The human gift for emotional expression through vocal communication became the basis for a new form of interstellar diplomacy that valued understanding over conquest and cooperation over domination. The war ended, not with victory or defeat but with the recognition that human voices carried something unique in the galaxy. The ability to convey complex emotions and abstract concepts that could touch even the most alien minds and remind them of universal truths that transcended species and technology and the artificial divisions that separated thinking beings from one another across the vast distances between stars.